The door splinters before you even hear the knock. You're asleep. It's 5:47 in the morning. Your kids are in the next room, and suddenly your front door is off its hinges, boots are thundering across your floor, and men in tactical gear are screaming words you can't process fast enough. Guns drawn, lights blinding. Your spouse is pulled from the bed. You're face down on the carpet before you can say a single word. And then, silence. One of the agents checks a piece of paper, looks up at his team, looks around the room. Wrong house. They leave. Just like that. They board up your door, hand you a card with a phone number, and walk back out into the morning like nothing happened. Your children are crying. Your hands won't stop shaking. Your home will never feel the same again. And here's the part that will make your blood boil. Under the law, as it stood for decades, there was almost nothing you could do about it. This is the story of the FBI raid that tore a family's life apart, the legal battle that followed, and the courtroom moment that forced the entire United States government to confront a question it had been avoiding for years. What happens when the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world kicks down the wrong door and then hides behind the law to avoid paying for it? What happened next didn't just change one family's life, it rewrote the rules for every federal agent in America. To understand why this case hit so hard, you have to understand something about how federal law enforcement had operated for a very long time. When the FBI, DEA, ATF, or any other federal agency conducts a raid, they operate under a legal doctrine that had shielded the government from accountability for generations. The doctrine is called sovereign immunity, and in simple terms, it means this: the government cannot be sued unless the government gives you permission to sue it. Think about that for a second. The most powerful institution in the country, with the most powerful weapons, the most powerful legal team, and the most powerful authority, also had the most powerful shield. And for decades, victims of botched raids, wrongful searches, and destroyed property had run directly into that shield and bounced off it. But the family in this story refused to bounce. The case centers on Leila Tarantino and her children in Reddington Beach, Florida. But to understand how everything fell apart for them, we need to go back a few years and understand exactly what the FBI was doing in her neighborhood that morning. Federal agents were tracking a fugitive, a serious suspect with a violent criminal history. Law enforcement had received intelligence placing this individual in a specific location, and they had built their operation around that intelligence. They obtained a warrant, they assembled a tactical team. They did everything, on paper, by the book. But the intelligence was wrong. Not slightly wrong, not close. The person they were looking for had no connection to Leila Tarantino's home, no prior residency, no association with her family. The address on the warrant was, by every meaningful measure, a mistake. And yet, before the sun came up that morning, the FBI executed the raid anyway. What happened inside that house in the hours and days that followed is where this story becomes something you genuinely cannot believe you haven't heard more about. Layla and her two children were subjected to what can only be described as a home invasion by the United States federal government. The raid lasted approximately 2 hours. Agents searched every room. Drawers were pulled out, closets were torn through. Personal belongings were scattered across the floor. Her children, young kids who had been asleep moments before, were traumatized in a way that doesn't wash off in the morning. One of them reportedly required psychological counseling afterward. And when it was over, when the agents had confirmed with certainty that they had the wrong house, the wrong family, the wrong everything, they left. The physical damage to the home was significant. The emotional damage was incalculable. Leila Tarantino did what any of us would do. She tried to hold someone accountable. Here's where it gets interesting. When her legal team began building a case, they ran into a wall that the American government had been quietly reinforcing for decades. Federal agents are not personally liable for actions they take in the performance of their duties, as long as those actions don't violate what's called clearly established law. This is a doctrine known as qualified immunity. You've probably heard that term before in the context of police brutality cases. But what many people don't realize is that qualified immunity doesn't just protect local cops, it extends to federal agents too. And in many ways, federal agents have even more insulation from consequences than local law enforcement. So here's the situation Leila's attorneys were facing. You have a family that was raided in error. You have a home that was damaged. You have children who were traumatized. And you have a legal system that was, structurally, designed to protect the people who did it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the government's response when the case was formally filed. Rather than acknowledge the error, express accountability, or offer any meaningful remedy, federal attorneys leaned into the legal machinery. They argued that the agents had acted in good faith. They argued that the warrant was lawfully obtained. They argued that even if the raid was a mistake, the government was protected. In other words, their position was essentially this: we kicked down the wrong door, terrorized a mother and her children, and we owe you nothing. Now, you might be wondering how a legal system built on justice could possibly allow that argument to succeed. And that is exactly the question that made this case so important. Because for a long time, it did succeed. Courts across the country had been ruling in favor of federal agencies in cases like this for years. The combination of sovereign immunity and qualified immunity had created what legal scholars started calling a accountability vacuum in federal law enforcement, a space where the most serious mistakes could be made, with the most devastating consequences, and no one was required to answer for them. Here's where the story takes a turn. Leila's case wound its way through the court system, and something unusual happened. A panel of judges, people who had spent careers navigating the careful, cautious language of federal law, looked at the facts of this case and flinched. Because what the Tarantino case exposed wasn't just one bad raid. It pulled back the curtain on a systemic problem that had been hiding in plain sight. The FBI and other federal agencies had conducted hundreds of wrong house raids over the years. In some cases, families had been compensated quietly through administrative channels. In many others, they had been stonewalled entirely. There was no public database, no formal tracking system, no requirement for agencies to even acknowledge publicly when a raid had been conducted at the wrong location. Think about that. The FBI could raid your home by mistake, and there was no law requiring them to tell anyone it had happened. The court found this deeply troubling. And in a ruling that sent shockwaves through the legal community, the judges declined to grant the full dismissal the government had requested. Instead, they allowed key claims to move forward, and in doing so, they opened a door that federal attorneys had spent decades trying to keep shut. What they discovered next would reshape the conversation around federal accountability in ways that legal experts are still unpacking today. Because embedded in the court's analysis was something remarkable. The judges looked at the Federal Tort Claims Act, a law that had existed since 1946, designed to give ordinary citizens a legal path to sue the federal government for certain wrongful acts. And they began asking a question that should have been asked much sooner. Had courts been interpreting this law too narrowly? Had sovereign immunity been used not as a shield against frivolous lawsuits, but as a weapon against legitimate victims? The government's lawyers had argued, as they almost always do, that the discretionary function exception applied. This is a legal clause within the Federal Tort Claims Act that protects the government when its employees are making judgment calls, essentially saying that if an agent was using their professional discretion, you can't sue for the outcome even if it was wrong. It is, on its face, a reasonable protection. Agents need to be able to make split-second decisions without worrying that every choice becomes a lawsuit. But the court said, wait, choosing which house to raid based on intelligence that hasn't been properly verified isn't protected discretion. It's a procedural failure, and procedural failures have consequences. This distinction, which might sound small, was actually enormous. It meant that the government could no longer use "we were making a judgment call" as a blanket defense when the fundamental error wasn't a judgment call at all. It was a failure to follow established protocol. Leila Tarantino didn't just survive the legal fight, she cracked the foundation. Now let's talk about what this means beyond one case, because this is the part that should matter to every single person watching this. In the years following the Tarantino case, civil liberties organizations began citing it in cases across the country. Attorneys representing families who had been subjected to wrong house raids, and there were more of them than most people realize, started using the legal framework it had established to push back against government immunity arguments. Legal scholars began writing about it in journals, and slowly, quietly, a shift began to happen in how federal courts approach the question of government accountability for wrong house raids. The FBI, for its part, was not publicly forthcoming about internal changes. Federal agencies rarely are. But court documents and Inspector General reports from the period following the case revealed that training protocols around address verification were under review, that the process for confirming location intelligence before executing a warrant was being re-examined, that, in other words, the system was being forced to look at itself. And that is sometimes how change happens in America. Not through legislation, not through press conferences. Through one family, One case, one judge, one ruling. But here's the thing that keeps the story from having a clean, satisfying ending. Because it doesn't. The accountability gap in federal law enforcement is still very real. Qualified immunity remains in place. The Federal Tort Claims Act still has exceptions that shield the government in a wide range of circumstances. Wrong house raids still happen. The data on how often federal agencies conduct raids at incorrect addresses is still not publicly available in any comprehensive form. The FBI does not publish a list of its mistakes. And the families who end up in the path of those mistakes, ordinary people sleeping in their beds, living their lives, are still navigating a legal system that was built at almost every level to protect the institution rather than the individual. Leila Tarantino's case changed what is possible. It did not change what is common. That distinction matters, because the lesson here isn't simply about one FBI raid. It's about who gets accountability in this country, and who has to fight for years through a hostile legal system just to be heard. It's about the gap between what the law promises and what the law delivers. It's about the fact that the most powerful law enforcement apparatus in human history can make a catastrophic mistake, traumatize a family, destroy a sense of safety that can never be fully rebuilt. And the default position of the system is to protect itself. The founders of this country were actually deeply worried about exactly this kind of power. The Fourth Amendment, which protects Americans against unreasonable searches and seizures, was written in direct response to a British colonial practice called general warrants, documents that gave soldiers the authority to search any home they chose without specific cause. The founders had lived through having their doors kicked in by people with badges and authority and no accountability. They wrote a constitution specifically to prevent that from happening in the new republic. And yet, centuries later, a mother in Florida woke up to boots on her floor and guns in her face and spent years in court just to establish the basic principle that someone should answer for it. That is the tension at the heart of this story. That is why it matters. That is why a case that most people have never heard of deserves to be told. Because the question it raises isn't just legal, it's moral. When the government makes a mistake that destroys a piece of your life, what do you deserve? An apology? Compensation? Accountability? A guarantee that the same thing won't happen to your neighbor next week? The answer, in a country built on the rule of law, should be obvious. But the Tarantino case is proof that obvious answers still have to be fought for. That rights on paper require real people willing to stand up and demand that they mean something. That the distance between what America says it believes and what America actually does is sometimes measured in shattered door frames and terrified children and years of litigation. What Leila Tarantino did, by refusing to accept the government's immunity arguments, by pushing her case forward when every institutional force was lined up against her, was something genuinely important. She made the system see itself. She forced a conversation that powerful people had every reason to avoid. And that conversation isn't over. If anything, in an era where the power of federal law enforcement continues to expand, where surveillance capabilities are greater than at any point in history, where the margin for error in intelligence gathering remains frustratingly real, the question of what happens when that power makes a mistake is more urgent than ever. The next time you hear about a wrong house raid, and there will be a next time, remember this case. Remember that there is a legal framework, however imperfect, that now exists partly because one woman refused to let the government walk away from what it did to her family. Remember that accountability doesn't come from institutions voluntarily. It comes from people who demand it. And remember that the door they're breaking down could be yours.